The operating room was cold, clinical, and eerily quiet except for the sound of surgical tools being prepared. It was November 1941, and a young woman, just 23 years old, lay strapped to the table. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of John F. Kennedy, who would later become the 35th President of the United States, and Robert F. Kennedy, a future U.S. Attorney General. She was nervous, frightened, and uncertain about what was happening to her. The doctors told her they were going to help her, but the truth was far more sinister. At the insistence of her father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., Rosemary was about to undergo one of the most controversial and damaging medical procedures of the 20th century, a lobotomy. At the time, it was touted as a miracle cure for mental illness. But the brutal reality was that it left thousands of patients incapacitated, stripped of their independence, and often destroyed for life. The surgeons began by drilling 2 small holes into her skull. Then, using a surgical instrument, they severed connections in her brain's prefrontal cortex. Rosemary was awake during the procedure, asked to recite nursery rhymes and sing songs while the doctors cut deeper and deeper. And then, suddenly, her words slurred. She stopped speaking. Her eyes went vacant. By the time the procedure ended, Rosemary Kennedy was no longer the vibrant young woman she had once been. She had been left permanently incapacitated, with the mental capacity of a toddler, a daughter, a sister, a life with so much promise. All stolen, not by disease or accident, but by a decision made by her own father. Before we begin, I want to thank my amazing viewers and subscribers for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagement helps make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. To understand the tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy, we first need to understand the world she was born into. Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13, 1918, in Brookline, Massachusetts. She was the 3rd child of Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, a powerful and ambitious couple who would go on to raise one of America's most famous and influential families. The Kennedys projected an image of strength, charm, and achievement. Joseph Sr. was a wealthy businessman with political aspirations, and Rose was the daughter of Boston Mayor John Honey Fitzgerald. Together, they cultivated a family built on discipline, tradition, and above all, success. But from the very beginning, Rosemary was different. Rosemary's story began with hardship. During her delivery, complications arose. The attending nurse, trying to delay the birth until the doctor could arrive, physically held Rosemary in the birth canal for 2 excruciating hours. This act, tragically common in an era when medical practices were far less advanced, deprived a newborn of oxygen. It is now believed that this oxygen deprivation caused brain damage, leading to lifelong developmental challenges. Rosemary appeared outwardly healthy, with the same dark hair and striking features as her siblings, but her developmental milestones were slow. As her brothers and sisters excelled, Rosemary struggled to keep pace. In a family where excellence was a standard, Rosemary's struggles stood out. She had difficulty learning to read and write, often lagging behind in school. Her coordination was weaker, and she found it harder to manage social interactions. Still, she was kind, affectionate, and loved by her siblings. Her bright smile and gentle nature made her endearing to those who truly knew her. But in the Kennedy household, affection came second to achievement. Joseph Sr. had sky-high ambitions for his children. He wanted senators, presidents, ambassadors. Anything less in his mind was failure. Rosemary's differences frustrated him. To a father obsessed with image and reputation, Rosemary's struggles weren't just personal challenges. They were flaws that could tarnish the Kennedy brand. By the time Rosemary was a teenager, her parents had begun sending her away to boarding schools and convents in hopes of fixing her behavior. In 1938, when Joseph Sr. became the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, the Kennedy family moved to London. Rosemary was placed in prestigious Catholic schools, but her difficulties remained. Teachers reported she was slow and often fell behind. Her letters home revealed a young woman desperate for approval. She wrote with affection to her mother, telling her how hard she was trying to be good. But behind her words was the constant struggle of a daughter who could never meet her father's impossible standards. Despite her challenges, Rosemary had moments of happiness. She loved dancing, music, and social events. Photographs from the time show her smiling at parties, often in elegant gowns, trying to keep up with her glamorous siblings. She also enjoyed writing in her diary. In those private pages, Rosemary revealed her insecurities, but also her sweet and earnest personality. She longed for independence, friendship, and love, the same things any young woman would want. Her diary entry spoke of crushes, worries about fitting in, and her determination to make her family proud. In many ways, Rosemary Kennedy was just like any other young woman of her time. But within the Kennedy dynasty, her vulnerabilities made her stand out, and not in the way her father wanted. Rosemary's siblings, Joe Jr., John JFK, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward, Ted, were competitive, brilliant, and constantly in the public eye. While her brothers were praised for their athleticism and intellect, Rosemary was often described as difficult, or slow. In a household where weakness was not tolerated, this left her isolated. Her mother, Rose, was devoutly Catholic and often distant. Her father, Joseph Sr., was harsh, domineering, and deeply concerned with appearances. For him, Rosemary's struggles represented not just personal hardship, but potential scandal. Still, there were those who loved her dearly. Eunice Kennedy, in particular, developed a lifelong bond with Rosemary. Eunice's later work in founding the Special Olympics was deeply inspired by her sister's experience. As Rosemary grew older, her differences became harder to conceal. By her late teens and early 20s, she began to exhibit mood swings, outbursts, and occasional aggression. Some reports suggest she sneaked out at night, resisted strict rules, and acted in ways her father saw as inappropriate for a young woman of her social status. At a time when mental health was poorly understood and women's behavior was tightly controlled, Rosemary's independence was viewed not as normal rebellion, but as dangerous. And for Joseph Sr., who dreamed of a son in the White House, a daughter with unpredictable behavior threatened to unravel everything. What do you think? If Rosemary had been born today, with modern medical care and understanding of developmental challenges, do you believe her life would have been drastically different? Share your thoughts in the comments. By 1940, Rosemary Kennedy was a young woman trying to carve out her place in the world. She was loving, hopeful, and eager for independence. But her father saw her not as an individual with her own dreams, but as a liability. The Kennedy family's ambitions were growing. Joseph Sr. wanted his sons to rise in politics, and appearances mattered more than ever. Rosemary's struggles, her outbursts, and her difficulty living within strict societal norms filled him with fear. Fear that she would embarrass the family. Fear that she would derail the dynasty he was building. And in that fear, Joseph Sr. made a decision, one that would forever alter Rosemary's life and haunt the Kennedy family for generations. He chose a procedure that promised a cure, but delivered only devastation: the lobotomy. The story of Rosemary Kennedy was already marked by difficulties at birth, but as she grew into childhood, adolescence, and eventually young adulthood, her struggles began to clash more and more with the demands of being a Kennedy, a family whose public image mattered more than almost anything else. The contrast between Rosemary's reality and the carefully manufactured perfection of the Kennedy dynasty would set the stage for decisions that were as chilling as they were irreversible. From a young age, Rosemary's differences were hard to ignore. She was slower to crawl, slower to walk, slower to talk. Teachers noticed she struggled to keep pace with other children, often distracted or unable to complete her lessons. What others considered simple, memorizing basic math tables, spelling, or reciting from a book, could be daunting for her. Still, Rosemary was not without her strengths. She was deeply affectionate, gentle, and had a sensitivity that drew certain people toward her. Family friends later remembered her as sweet and gentle, but also described moments when she seemed overwhelmed by frustration or sadness. The Kennedy family, however, had little patience for weakness. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., her father, was a man who demanded perfection and achievement. He expected his children to succeed academically, socially, and eventually politically, and he treated their failures not as personal struggles, but as stains on the family name. By the time Rosemary was a teenager, her difficulties became harder to hide. She was easily distracted, and sometimes her mood shifted rapidly from calmness to agitation. At school, she sometimes acted out, and her academic progress was painfully slow compared to her siblings. The Kennedy children were expected to be stars. Rosemary was not. And in a family where public image meant everything, that difference became dangerous. Growing up as a Kennedy was no easy thing. The family motto could well have been, "Win at all costs." Joseph Sr. instilled a competitive spirit in his children from the beginning. Jack, Bobby, Ted, even the girls, were all pushed to excel. Athletics, academics, charm, social life. Nothing was optional. Everything had to be perfected. But Rosemary simply couldn't compete. When her brothers were excelling in prep schools and her sisters were thriving socially, Rosemary often fell behind. Her handwriting was shaky, her speech sometimes halting. She struggled to grasp subjects that came easily to others. And in the Kennedy household, failure was not just a disappointment. It was a humiliation. Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, tried in her own way to cope with Rosemary's challenges. She sought private tutors, schools with more structure, and eventually even institutions where the focus was on children with learning difficulties. Rosemary was shuttled from school to school, Sacred Heart Convent in Rhode Island, boarding schools in Pennsylvania, even specialized programs in England during the Kennedy family's time abroad. But each change seemed to underline the same problem. Rosemary was different, and different was unacceptable in a family obsessed with success. To understand how events escalated, we need to step back and remember the world of the 1920s and 1930s. At that time, intellectual and developmental disabilities were not well understood. Terms that would now be considered cruel were casually used by doctors, teachers, and even family members. Public perception was equally harsh. Families often had relatives with disabilities, sending them away to institutions where they were rarely spoken of again. The concept of inclusion simply didn't exist, and stigma was everywhere. For the Kennedys, a family already rising in prominence, the stakes were even higher. Joseph Sr. was ambitious, politically, socially, financially. He had dreams of seeing his children not only succeed, but dominate American public life. And in his mind, Rosemary's struggles threatened all of it. A daughter who struggled intellectually, a daughter who might one day be publicly recognized as slow or incapable. For Joseph Sr., this was unthinkable. It wasn't just Rosemary's future at risk. In his eyes, it was the family's. As Rosemary entered adolescence, her challenges intensified. At dances and social events, she struggled to keep pace with her peers. She sometimes grew frustrated and lashed out, then felt guilty afterward. Her diary, one of the few personal relics we have from her younger years, shows her yearning to be like everyone else. She wrote about wanting to go to dances, to be admired, to have friends. She dreamed of love, of belonging, but behind the scenes, her parents worried. Reports from her teachers grew more concerning. Rosemary sometimes snuck out at night, wandering away from the school grounds. She occasionally displayed behavior that alarmed her caretakers, mood swings, sudden bursts of anger, or moments of withdrawal that seemed almost oppressive. By today's standards, none of this would have warranted extreme intervention. Many young people with learning differences and emotional struggles go on to live fulfilling lives, given the right support. But in the Kennedy household and in the rigid, unforgiving social climate of the time, it was viewed as a looming catastrophe. To understand why events unfolded as they did, we need to look closely at Joseph Sr. He was not a man who tolerated obstacles. He had clawed his way up in the financial world, using his cunning and connections to become a wealthy businessman. He harbored political ambitions, and he transferred those ambitions to his children. His sons, especially, were expected to lead. Joe, Jr. was groomed for the presidency. Jack, though sickly, was expected to follow in his brother's shadow. Bobby and Ted were raised in the same mold. And for the daughters, including Rosemary, the expectation was no less intense. They would be polished, charming, and socially flawless, the perfect complement to their brother's ambitions. In Joseph Sr.'s mind, Rosemary's struggles were not just personal failures. They were threats to his grand vision of a Kennedy dynasty. And so, while Rosemary yearned simply to belong, her father began searching for ways to fix her. By the late 1930s, Rosemary's situation had become increasingly difficult to hide. Teachers reported her wandering behavior, her mood swings, her inability to keep pace. Social events revealed her differences. Though she tried desperately to please, the gap between her and her peers grew wider with age. There were moments of hope. During the Kennedy family's time in England, while Joseph Sr. served as U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James, Rosemary briefly found a place in a convent school where she seemed to thrive. She enjoyed the structure and care of the nuns, and for a time, her progress seemed steady. But even then, concerns remained. She was vulnerable, easily influenced, and at times impulsive. As she grew into a young woman, her family feared she might engage in relationships or behaviors that could create scandal. For Joseph Sr., this was intolerable. The Kennedy name had to remain untarnished. By the time the family returned to the United States in 1940, the pressures were mounting. The war in Europe, the family's political ambitions, the social scrutiny, all of it combined to make Rosemary's differences more glaring, at least in her father's eyes. And it was around this time that Joseph Sr. began to hear whispers of a new medical procedure, one that promised to calm agitation, control mood swings, and make difficult patients more manageable. It was called the prefrontal lobotomy. The lobotomy was, at the time, being hailed by some as a breakthrough. Developed in the 1930s, it was promoted as a miracle cure for a wide range of mental health issues, from depression to schizophrenia to anxiety. The procedure involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area thought to control personality and behavior. Though crude and dangerous, it was presented to desperate families as a solution, a way to bring peace, calm, and normalcy to loved ones who struggled. Joseph Sr. seized upon the idea. In his mind, Rosemary was too difficult, too unpredictable, too much of a liability. A procedure that could make her docile, compliant, and easy to manage seemed to answer his prayers. It didn't matter that the surgery was experimental. It didn't matter that the risks were immense. It didn't matter that Rosemary herself could not truly consent. What mattered to Joseph Sr. was control. And so he made the decision. Without consulting his wife, without fully informing his children, and without giving Rosemary a real choice, he arranged for the surgery. It is impossible to overstate how chilling this decision was. Rosemary was not sick in a way that would justify such an extreme measure. She was not violent, not a danger to herself or others. She was simply a young woman with learning differences and emotional struggles, a young woman who wanted to dance, to write in her diary, to live a life with love and meaning. But to Joseph Sr., she was a liability, and liabilities, in his world, had to be managed. In November 1941, when Rosemary was just 23 years old, Joseph Sr. arranged for her to undergo a lobotomy. She had no idea what awaited her. The autumn air of November 1941 was cool in Washington, D.C. The war in Europe dominated headlines. Families across America were bracing for what felt inevitable, the country's entry into global conflict. But in one quiet hospital room, a different kind of battle was being prepared. It wasn't a battle fought with weapons. It wasn't a battle between nations. It was a battle over one woman's mind, and the decision, made without her true consent, to silence her forever. Rosemary Kennedy was just 23 years old. She arrived at George Washington University Hospital under the care of two physicians, Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts. At the time, these men were celebrated by some as pioneers in mental health. To Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., they represented hope, the promise of control over a daughter who didn't fit neatly into his vision of a flawless family. But to Rosemary, they represented something else entirely. She may not have fully understood what was about to happen, but she trusted her father. She trusted the authority of doctors. And in that trust, she was led to a procedure that would change her life forever. The room was stark and sterile, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. The instruments were laid out, metal clamps, retractors, and the tools designed for lobotomy itself. At that time, Lobotomies were performed by drilling small holes into the skull and inserting a surgical instrument into the brain. The surgeon would then sever connections in the prefrontal cortex, the region thought to govern behavior, judgment, and personality. The idea was crude. The science was incomplete. Yet to families desperate for answers, it was sold as progress. As Rosemary was placed on the table, she was given only local anesthesia. She was awake, fully conscious. Doctors of that era believed it was necessary to monitor a patient's responses during the surgery, to know when they had cut enough. Imagine, for a moment, the terror she must have felt. Dr. Freeman and Dr. Watts began the operation by drilling 2 holes into Rosemary's skull near the front of her head. Through these openings, they inserted a slender surgical tool called a lobotomy. The instrument was designed to sweep through the brain tissue, severing the delicate fibers that connected the frontal lobes to the rest of the brain. As the doctors worked, they asked Rosemary to perform simple tasks. Sing God Bless America. Count backwards from 100. Her voice, hesitant at first, wavered as the procedure went on. She began to lose her place. Her speech slurred. At one point, her words fell into fragments. Then silence. And that silence told the surgeons what they wanted to hear. They had cut deep enough. It was a silence of a mind forever altered. When the surgery was over, Rosemary was wheeled into recovery. But the bright, lively young woman who had once loved to dance, who had dreamed of romance and wrote longings into her diary, she was gone. In her place was someone who could barely speak, barely move, barely care for herself. Her mental capacity had been reduced to that of a young child. Tasks she once managed with effort, writing, conversation, even walking with grace, were now impossible. She would never again live independently. The evidence of the crime was not a bloodied weapon or a ransacked room. It was Rosemary herself, her halting speech, her unsteady movements, the vacant look that replaced her once bright eyes. And this evidence could never be erased. At first, Joseph Sr. may have convinced himself the procedure was a success. Perhaps he told himself Rosemary would calm down, become easier to manage, less of a burden. But the truth was undeniable within days. Rosemary was incapacitated. She could no longer write in her diary, could no longer attend dances, could no longer dream of love or family. Her life had been stolen, not by fate, not by illness, but by a decision her own father made. For the Kennedy family, the reaction was swift and brutal. Rosemary was quietly removed from the spotlight. Her story was buried under silence. While her brothers rose to prominence, Joe Jr. in the military, Jack in politics, Bobby in law, Rosemary was sent away, hidden from public view. The family that once paraded their children as paragons of success now kept one daughter locked away as if she were a secret. It's difficult to imagine the loneliness Rosemary must have felt in the days after her surgery. One day, she was a young woman yearning to belong. The next, she was robbed of the ability to advocate for herself, robbed of the chance to grow, robbed of her very essence. The tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy is not just the lobotomy itself. It is the betrayal behind it. She was not a danger to others. She was not incapable of living a meaningful life. She was simply different in a time when difference was punished, and the punishment she endured was permanent. What makes this story all the more devastating is the way it was handled afterward. The Kennedys, a family obsessed with their image, kept Rosemary's condition hidden. Few outside the inner circle knew what had happened. To the public, she had simply retreated from view. But behind closed doors, her mother, Rose Kennedy, was devastated. Accounts suggest she was not fully aware of Joseph Sr.'s plan until after the surgery was done. The rift it created in their marriage never fully healed. For Rosemary's siblings, the truth was a mix of shame, grief, and secrecy. Some rarely spoke of her. Others, like Eunice Kennedy Shriver, would later channel their guilt and love into advocacy, founding the Special Olympics decades later. But at the time, silence reigned. And Rosemary, once the smiling daughter, once the sister who longed to be included, was left to live out her days in institutions, her life irrevocably altered. The lobotomy of Rosemary Kennedy was not a medical miracle. It was a crime in all but name, a violation of her autonomy, her dignity, her future. And the crime scene was not a dark alley or a secluded house. It was a sterile hospital room, sanctioned by medicine, paid for by a father's ambition, and sealed by silence. What happened in November 1941 would haunt the Kennedy family for generations. And for Rosemary, it marked the end of her independence and the beginning of a long, hidden life, one spent in the shadows, away from the dynasty she once belonged to. The truth about what had happened to Rosemary Kennedy was not immediately known to the public. For decades, the Kennedy family worked to shield her from view, to guard the secret of her condition, and to rewrite the narrative of her absence. It was a silence that lasted nearly half a century, and when the truth eventually emerged, it would reshape not only how people saw Rosemary, but also how they judged Joseph Kennedy Sr. and the decisions he had made in pursuit of prestige, power, and control. But to understand this final chapter of Rosemary's story, we must begin with the years immediately following her lobotomy, a period marked by secrecy, pain, and profound consequences that extended far beyond Rosemary herself. After the failed lobotomy in 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was left with the mental capacity of a toddler. She struggled to walk, spoke only a handful of words, and required constant assistance for even the most basic tasks. She was no longer able to live with her family, not even under the constant care of her mother, Rose Kennedy. Instead, Joseph Sr. made a decision that was as harsh as it was final. Rosemary would be institutionalized. She was sent first to a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, and later transferred to St. Coletta, a Catholic-run institution for people with intellectual disabilities in Jefferson, Wisconsin. There, far from the public eye and the social circles of Washington and Hyannisport, Rosemary lived in near total seclusion. Her siblings were told little about her condition in the early years. Rose Kennedy herself admitted later in life that she had not been fully informed about the extent of the surgery beforehand, and she carried deep resentment toward her husband for keeping her in the dark. For the rest of her life, she would rarely discuss the lobotomy, speaking of Rosemary only in vague, painful terms. But for Rosemary, every day was a quiet struggle. Nurses and nuns described her as sweet and gentle, but also noted how her moods could swing between frustration and calm. She loved music, something that had stayed with her since girlhood, and would often sit near the piano when someone played. She enjoyed walks outdoors when her health allowed it. Yet her independence, once so precious to her, was gone forever. The girl who had once wanted to be a teacher, who had written hopeful diary entries about dances and friends, had been reduced to a shadow of herself, hidden away because her father feared the public would see her as a stain on the Kennedy family's perfect image. The Kennedy family rarely spoke of Rosemary in public. When asked, they gave vague responses, saying she was shy or reclusive, avoiding questions about her whereabouts. In family photographs, her absence was explained away or ignored. Even among her siblings, there was confusion. John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and their brothers and sisters did not see Rosemary for years at a time. For some of them, it was only as adults that they learned the full truth of what had happened. The secrecy was, in many ways, part of Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s lifelong strategy. He believed that the Kennedy family image had to be spotless, polished, ambitious, inspiring. To admit that his daughter had suffered severe mental and physical disability at the hands of botched surgery he had authorized would have been to admit failure, weakness, and scandal. And so the silence continued. But silence does not erase suffering. In many ways, Rosemary Kennedy's story became a trial, not in a courtroom with lawyers and juries, but in the court history. The verdict was shaped over decades as more information emerged. By the 1960s and 1970s, whispers began to circulate about Rosemary. Some journalists and biographers noted her absence and raised questions. But it wasn't until after Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s death in 1969 that the truth began to leak out. It was revealed that Rosemary had undergone a lobotomy at her father's direction, and that the procedure had left her permanently incapacitated. For many, the revelation was shocking, even horrifying. Joseph Sr. was harshly judged, seen by some as a man who had sacrificed his daughter's well-being on the altar of ambition. His choice reflected the cold, utilitarian mindset of an era that often valued appearances over humanity, but also revealed a darker side of his personality. Authoritarian, controlling, and obsessed with the Kennedy name. The historical jury was unanimous in its condemnation. Rosemary had been robbed of her future by the very people meant to protect her. Among Rosemary's siblings, one sister in particular was deeply affected by what had happened. Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Eunice, who was close to Rosemary growing up, saw her sister's struggles firsthand. She recognized not only Rosemary's humanity, but also the injustice of how society, and even her own family, had treated her. It was this awareness that drove Eunice to become an advocate for people with intellectual disabilities. In 1962, she wrote a groundbreaking article for the Saturday Evening Post, openly discussing Rosemary's struggles for the first time. In it, she acknowledged that Rosemary was mentally retarded, the language of the era, and spoke candidly about the challenges her sister faced. Eunice's words helped break the silence, and they laid the foundation for one of the most important legacies to emerge from Rosemary's tragedy, the Special Olympics. Founded in 1968, the Special Olympics gave athletes with intellectual disabilities a platform to showcase their abilities, dignity, and determination. Eunice often said that her sister Rosemary was her greatest inspiration. In this way, Rosemary's suffering, though never chosen, became the seed of a movement that transformed millions of lives. In the later decades of Rosemary's life, after Joseph Sr. passed away, her siblings began visiting her more regularly. John F. Kennedy, during his presidency, quietly supported initiatives for mental health, influenced in part by his sister's condition. Robert Kennedy also visited her, as did their younger siblings. Rose Kennedy, though pained by what had happened, spent time with Rosemary in Wisconsin, bringing her into the family fold as best she could. Yet for Rosemary herself, the years were often marked by routine and solitude. She lived at St. Coletta until her death, surrounded by caregivers who describe her as affectionate but childlike. She outlived many of her siblings, passing away in 2005 at the age of 86. By then, her story had become widely known, and she was no longer a secret. Today, Rosemary Kennedy's story is often told as a cautionary tale. It reveals the dangers of unchecked medical practices, lobotomies that were performed with little understanding of their consequences. It also highlights the stigma of disability in the early 20th century, a stigma so strong that even one of America's most powerful families felt compelled to hide their daughter away. But it also reveals something else: resilience. Rosemary herself endured unimaginable loss, yet her life inspired change. Because of her, Eunice Kennedy Shriver fought to create opportunities for people with disabilities, sparking a movement that continues to this day. The Special Olympics is perhaps Rosemary's greatest legacy, a reminder that every life has value and that dignity must never be sacrificed for the sake of reputation. At this point, I want to ask you, how do you feel about Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s decision? Was it a product of his time, or was it an unforgivable act of control and betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Rosemary Kennedy never had the chance to live the life she wanted. Her dreams of teaching, of independence, of love, all were taken from her in a single, irreversible decision. Yet in the tragedy of her story, we find lessons that endure. Her life forces us to ask how we treat those who are different. Do we value them for who they are, or do we hide them away because they do not fit our vision perfection? For the Kennedy family, Rosemary was both a secret and a source of transformation. For the world, she became a symbol of pain, of injustice, but also of progress. And that brings us to the end of this case, a story so disturbing it leaves you questioning how many others are suffering in silence. What are your thoughts on this case? Let me know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit that like button and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.